Hello everyone, welcome to the Empowering Children's webinar. We're delighted you could join us. We have a really interesting range of speakers today, all of whom will talk to the importance of listening to children as victims of domestic violence. Barnardos has worked with thousands of children who've been impacted by domestic violence. And last year, at the height of COVID, we conducted a survey which demonstrated that 1 in 3 families in receipt of our targeted family support services were experiencing domestic violence. Barnardos coordinates the Children's Domestic Violence and Abuse project, and this is an interagency initiative funded by CUSLA. Children have told us about the impact of domestic violence, and I want to quote something from a video that you will hear more of later. So in their own words, domestic violence, this is what it means to them. This is its impact. It's a bad feeling in our hearts. It feels like it is broken. Sometimes we feel it in our bodies too, and our bones begin to hurt. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who's Dr. Stephanie Holt. Stephanie is the head of the School of Social Work and Social Policy, and she also chairs the Childhood Domestic Violence and Abuse Project. Hello, Steph. Now, Steph also, as you will all know, has a real expertise in the issue of domestic violence and its impact on children. And she also is a member of Barnardos Service Committee, and a fantastic participant in that. So over to you, Steph.
Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Just get my PowerPoint up there. Congratulations to Barnardos for organising this important webinar, which has a really welcome, I would say, and significant title, Empowering Children, with a focus on the impact of childhood domestic violence and abuse. This event is important because for many decades, children weren't terribly visible really on the canvas of domestic violence and abuse policy, research and practice. In fact, it's only recently that the lens of interest and inquiry has broadened considerably to include an in-depth and very child-centred insight into how children experiencing living with domestic violence and abuse. Needless to say, I'm really glad I'm up first, as I can see from the agenda that I'm followed here today by a really exciting lineup of highly skilled researchers, advocates, practitioners engaging with children and families who live with domestic violence and abuse. So as such, I'm going to leave the nuances of practice and the expertise of advocacy to the experts that follow me and the researchers that follow me, and focus instead on what I hope is a scene-setting presentation with my key message stressing the critical importance of positioning children as central to the family experience of domestic violence and abuse. We can do that in many ways through our inclusive research practice, our advocacy work, our direct practice, and our awareness-raising activities, many of which you're going to hear about later on this morning. Regardless of your discipline, however, we know now that children hear and see, as Suzanne said, so much more than adults in the main ever consider, particularly non-abusive parents who are trying to protect them. And they feel the violence in ways way beyond what adults often comprehend and can articulate what that feels like Suzanne said, and where they feel it. And Anya will present on that later on this morning. Moving away, therefore, from those kind of previously held views that children are only impacted if they're awake, if they're in the room, or if they're hurt. We now know, largely from the contribution of children themselves to the research agenda and more sophisticated research methods, such as Katie will present on later on, that living with domestic violence and abuse for children is an embodied experience that they experience with all of their senses. They clearly don't need to be awake, they don't need to be in the same room, and they don't need to be directly hurt to experience fear, anxiety, and distress. As such, the central tenet throughout this presentation is that children are an integral part of the family's narrative of living with domestic violence and abuse. They're not merely a footnote to their parents' experience. Rather, As Callaghan and Alexander state, they are human beings who live with, experience, and make sense of domestic abuse. So my presentation today, as I said, takes kind of a broad brush understanding that I have and other researchers in the field have developed over the last, 20 years or so from engaging with children and young people about the principles that should guide and inform our understanding of, our research with, our interventions and responses to the needs of children who live with domestic violence and abuse. So returning once more to the wonderful title of this seminar, Empowering Children, and reflecting over the last few days over my presentation for this morning, I've been so lucky to be part of a growing movement of research and researchers across Europe, I suppose largely in the UK, Ireland and the Nordic countries specifically, in North America and Australia, as you'll hear later on. And I believe this movement has made quite a powerful and even, I might go as far as saying, empowering contribution to positioning children quite centrally in the family's experience of domestic violence and abuse. This kind of broad church of research straddling the last couple of decades, and indeed, I suppose, many continents and countries, has not only included the voice of children experiencing domestic violence and abuse, but has used those voices, as Katie will show later on, as empirical data, and I think, importantly, as what I'd call analytical starting points for conversations and for understandings of what it's like to be a child and to live with domestic violence and abuse. This, of course, as we know, reflects an international commitment to understanding children, not just as collateral damage, but rather as active actors in the narrative of their evolving lives. So, I guess reflecting on the power of research knowledge, which I'd be very committed to, I would argue that this knowledge is critical for all practitioners who work with children and adolescents in their everyday lives. It's critical for researchers who develop and evaluate interventions and treatment methods, and indeed for policymakers who make decisions every day that affect children and adolescents' lives. So, across those three domains of policy, practice, and research, I would argue that we need children's knowledge about their own lives, but children actually have a right to make their voices heard in matters that concern them. This does reflect that commitment to honouring the principle of listening to the voice of the child, as demanded by nation states across Europe, and by recognising and indeed accepting children as significant social actors in the unfolding story of their family lives. As researchers, and as that group of researchers looking at children's experiences, we argue for the inclusion of children in research, and we assert that this argument is grounded in the evidence that research benefits children and young people who are experiencing domestic violence by garnering really, really valuable insights into how professionals might not only better understand them, but also support them to feel safe, to stay and to feel safe. And I suppose research with and for children is by far a trouble-free endeavour. As many of us know, there's many multiple challenges to their inclusion in the research process, not least ethical boards or ethical committees in many countries, the thorny and difficult but really important issue of consent, and indeed the risk that many want to guard against re-traumatisation that children may experience from being part of that research process. I would say, though, as researchers, we can never eliminate this risk, but neither can we guarantee that the study we conduct will not in any way cause discomfort, upset, or even harm. However, what we do need to do is to take every precaution possible to make sure that the probable gains outweigh the potential risks in the research that we conduct. So how do we do this? I think when we conduct our interviews with children who've experienced traumatic events like living with domestic violence and abuse, we need to create that situation that's the direct opposite to the abusive situation or environment that the child experienced in the past. That is, a situation which is predictable, agreed on beforehand, and clearly structured. I guess our aim, really, as Davina James Hanman would say, our aim is to make their world bigger by creating an environment that is respectful, that is considerate, it's attentive to their needs, and also, I think importantly, a situation where the child is in control. They're in control of what they say, what questions they answer, when to take breaks, when to finish. So integral to that success when conducting research with children is the necessity for the child to feel that their involvement is essential, that they are the experts and what they have to say is important. And it's an interesting but really important and critical switch where the adult becomes the listener in need of knowledge, and the child is, in research terms, we call them the teller with expertise that needs to be shared. Most importantly, I would argue, and as will become evident when Katie presents, is that research needs to start from a position that accepts the uniqueness of each child and their lived experience, and indeed to commit to a practice that values and indeed prioritises the right of children to use their voice to participate in research, which is, after all, about them. This, I believe, is one of the ways when engaging with children who've experienced domestic violence and abuse that we can empower them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steph, for that really powerful presentation. And there is so much that I would like to discuss with you in relation to that. It's a couple of things struck me really, which was the importance of children being involved in research and that being done in a really ethical way and a safe way. And both our need to do that in order to provide the services that children need and also to advocate appropriately on their behalf. And I just thought you really highlighted the value and the importance of that. So in that context, and something, Steph, that you referenced quite a lot in the context of what Katie now will be able to provide us with, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Katie Lamb. And Katie is a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, and she will speak to her perspective of the importance of involving children and young people in the aftermath of family violence. So welcome, Katie. Welcome the whole way from Melbourne, the joys of digital success in this world. So look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for inviting me here today, all the way from the other side of the world where we are in a hard lockdown. So it's a complete pleasure to be here. Firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional Aboriginal owners of the land that I live on and that I'm working on today, and that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the challenging times we are living in at the moment and acknowledge all of those who have been personally impacted by COVID-19. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge the challenges that have been faced by our frontline community services workers who have been thrown into a situation that's really never been faced before in delivering support services to families from a distance. Our anecdotal evidence suggests that the past year has been a really tough and difficult and dangerous one for victim survivors of domestic violence. And throughout the various lockdowns, and as I say, we're locked down here at the moment, it was really hard not to think about the families and children who are effectively in prison with violent family members. In fact, where I live now, we're experiencing that all over again and the challenges that come with it. We know that the evidence is really clear that domestic violence impacts children and young people, and we've got plenty of studies internationally which show us that children from families where there is violence are more likely to experience poorer outcomes across a broad range of measures of health and well-being. We also know that in families where there is domestic violence, there are more likely to be other forms of child abuse occurring, including emotional abuse, physical and child sexual abuse. And it's well documented that the cumulative impacts of experiencing these multiple forms of abuse can be particularly damaging for children. And while our evidence base is building, I believe we've gained some of our richest insights into the impact of domestic violence on children's lives by asking children themselves. And by way of background, I generally wear two hats. Part of the week I work as a university research fellow, and the rest of the week I work as a consultant focused on policy and training. And today I'm going to try and marry my research findings with some of the policy work that I've been involved in recently. So in my research role in the Safer Families team at the University of Melbourne, we're focused on looking for ways we can enhance the priority given to those who have lived experience of domestic violence within research and teaching across the university and more broadly across the domestic violence service system. Much of our research is now co-designed with a group of survivor advisors, and we've recently released a framework to guide formal processes for survivor engagement across domestic violence services, and that's publicly available, that work. I've learnt many things from the survivor advocates I work with, but one of the key things I've learned is that they have plenty to say. But in order to hear them, the most important thing we need to do is stop talking and make the effort to really listen. We know that children who experience domestic violence often describe feeling ignored and invisible. And so asking them about their experiences is one way we can start to shift that dynamic. However, as Stephanie's touched on earlier, I also agree we still have a range of barriers in our way when it comes to really hearing the lived experience of victim survivors of domestic violence, and that's whether they're adults or they're children and young people. And one of the issues that is raised is this concern about the potential for harming victim survivors or the re-traumatisation. And I think it's really important to note in the Victorian Family Violence Lived Experience Framework, which we've released last year, our survivor researchers added a principle, and it's really interesting to see their take on those principles. And so they added a principle: issues relating to legal, physical, emotional and cultural safety of survivor advocates should be carefully considered but not used as a mechanism for exclusion. And I think that's something that we're really actively promoting in the work that we are doing. And, this is something Stephanie has written about beautifully before. And I think we really need to think about the importance of ensuring that children and young people who have experienced domestic violence are consulted about issues which impact their lives and the potential benefits as well that they experience by feeling recognised as the experts of their own lives and lived experience. So for me, safety is a really important consideration when working with victim survivors, but so too is offering opportunities to have their voices and stories heard, and also crucially looking for ways that our research can influence service responses. So today I'm going to draw upon research I undertook with children and young people who have experienced domestic violence who are aged between 9 and 19 years. I'm going to try and place this research in the context of some of the reforms that are happening in Victoria, the state in which I live. So in terms of my research, I had two key aims. The first was to gain insights into children's perspectives on the relationship between fathers who use violence and their children. Secondly, to understand the key messages that children would like fathers who use violence to understand about the impacts of violence on their children. And I think it's really important to note that the way in which the research and interview questions were worded in this study allowed for children and young people to make a choice about how they'd answer. So the questions allowed for responses to be in the third person if children didn't feel comfortable disclosing their own experiences. And a couple of the younger children took up this option. So therefore they made comments like, I think a child that has a father who is frightening might feel like, or might wish that. And I think this idea of offering children and young people who have experienced domestic violence opportunities and choice is a recurring theme throughout my own but other research in this space. In terms of the research methods I used, I first interviewed the children either on their own or as part of sibling groups, again, as they preferred, again, giving that choice. Following the interview, participants were offered an opportunity to come to a workshop to make a digital story about the key messages they have for fathers, which could then be played to men who attend a program to address their violence. We call them men's behavioural change programs here. 6 young people decided to take up this offer, and their stories are both powerful and harrowing. We're actually going to watch a couple of the stories now. They do come with a warning in terms of the content is highly emotive, and anyone in the group who has lived experience of family violence may be impacted. So I'd just like to give that trigger warning before we show the story. The other thing to note is the children's voices have been digitally altered. So with the Australian accents and the digitalisation, I'm hoping that the audio is still clear enough for people to understand.
phone is the one thing that I feel keeps me safe. It means that when you do something to me, at least I can call someone for help. When I saw you yesterday, I was so scared. You asked me to leave my phone in the glove box. You said I wouldn't need it. But I remember what happened last time. I remember that day so clearly. We were out for lunch. I was trying to express my feelings. All that would come out were words like I hate you. You got up and slapped me across the face. You took my phone. You locked me in a room. I couldn't call anyone. I thought you would hurt me again. Luckily, before you took my phone, I sent a quick message to Mum that you slapped me. After that, I didn't want to see you anymore. Would you want to see someone who physically and emotionally hurts you? So when you tried to take my phone yesterday, I said no. I said I don't really like you. I would rather spend my weekends doing something else than seeing you. You said that's okay, you just won't have a father anymore. Even though I don't want to spend time with someone who hurts me emotionally and physically, it still makes me upset that you don't make an effort to be there. I shouldn't have to feel unsafe and scared around you. You are meant to be there for me. It all started when I was little. You used to come and go. Some days you would be there and then you wouldn't. Why? I was little and I didn't understand. You started drinking a lot and you and Mum would always start fighting. You didn't think I saw it, but I did. I saw a lot. I saw a lot more than I wanted to. You and Mum split up, and at that time I didn't understand why. But now I do. Mum was getting hurt, emotionally and physically, by you. The reason I got my phone was to contact you, to talk to you. Now my phone has become something it shouldn't. It's something I need to keep me safe from you.
So during the interviews with children and young people, I asked them about what they saw as the characteristics and behaviours of a good father and how they felt their own father compared. And it's fairly heartbreaking to note that 2 of the children said they really couldn't comment on what a good father was like, as they had no experience to draw on. And as far as they were concerned, that they genuinely believed that all men are abusive and should be feared. For the remaining young people in the study, I've been able to group their responses to these questions under 4 key themes. The first I've called communication. Children and young people saw meaningful and respectful communication as a skill of good fathers and something that wasn't really present in their relationship with their own fathers. The children in the study talked about a good father as someone who is supportive and shows interest in them and wanted to be involved in their lives. However, they talked about their own fathers being quite present physically, but disinterested in them and their lives, never really wanting to do anything with them. The majority of children spoke about a good father being someone who made their children feel special, valued, loved, and wanted. However, this really contrasted with their own experiences with their fathers, who they described as inflicting significant emotional and verbal abuse. One young woman described her father as seeing she and her sister as products of their mother, and so they felt their father treated them with a watered-down version of the hatred he held for her. The second theme I've called control. My findings were consistent with other research, such as that by Emma Katz, which has found that in the context of domestic violence, children and young people's lives are infused with coercive control, much like their mothers' lives are. Children and young people in my study spoke about their father's use of control, both in terms of controlling their access to money and resources, but also through surveillance and isolation. And I think the quote on this slide is a really powerful example of what the children and young people spoke about. And this is a quote from one of the digital stories. And when I asked this young person where they got the idea for these powerful words, she simply stated that it had come from her experience earlier that morning when she saw her father ducking behind posts at the train station on her way into the workshop, even though there were legal orders in place which restricted him from coming anywhere near her. Another way in which young people talked about control was the way in which their fathers used fear to ensure compliance. And the children spoke quite a lot about the difference between discipline and abuse. And they commented that society can be quite unclear about this. A number of children in the study had experienced harsh and abusive behaviour from their fathers, but recalled that when they told adults, including courts, about this, it had been brushed off as merely discipline, which didn't sit well with them at all. A number of the young people in the study said that the use of abuse and fear as a means of controlling children leads to compliance, but did not lead to children having respect for their fathers. And they felt this was something their fathers didn't understand. One chilling comment came from a teenaged boy who described this strong discipline he had experienced as really important. And he said, children are like wild animals in the woods. They need to be trained like wolves so they behave how you want them to. And I remember at the time just feeling, that real shiver down my spine at the is what that meant in terms of his thinking. A number of children in the study also talked about how the abuse they'd experienced had led to them feeling frightened and permanently afraid of being killed. The third theme young people talked about I've called role modelling, and research with fathers more generally has found that being a good role model is considered one of the most important elements of being a father by fathers. And children in this study agreed. They described a good father as someone who is moral, trustworthy, and reliable. However, when it came to describing their own fathers, they didn't feel that he provided a healthy example for themselves or their siblings. They also didn't feel that he gave them insight into how to form healthy, equitable relationships with others. And this bothered young people a lot. And some even said they could already see this playing out for them with people they chose to date who didn't treat them with respect. And the quote on the slide illustrates that. The young people also talked about their father's lack of reliability in doing things he said he was going to do, or turning up when he said he would, as a real barrier to building trust. The fourth theme I've called child-centered parenting, and this summarises young people's view that a good father should always put his children's needs and safety first. They were clear that they did not feel their fathers had done this, and they actually described their fathers making them feel incredibly unsafe themselves, or also leaving them in the care of other unsafe people. A number of participants in the study expressed great sadness that their father did not seem to place much value on their relationship with him. Some described having better relationships with their father when they were younger, but as soon as they had opinions or sought greater independence, their father's emotional abuse and violence escalated. And we're going to watch another one of the digital stories now.
This is a message to all dads. I'm writing to you about what I think is good and bad about dads. Good dads hug you and are happy. A good dad spends quality time with you. I like maths, and a good dad helps with homework. Some dads help by making worksheets. Good dads let you go and see your friends, and let friends be together without interrupting. A good dad would be home more. A good dad would be okay if I went out by myself and he would trust me. He would trust me and my mum to go places like the shopping centre and not need to know all the details of where we are and what we're buying, or what time we come home, or who we talk to on the phone. I would want him to be a hard worker and support our family. He would not yell too loudly and never hurt me. I should be able to have friends and they come over even when he's in a bad mood. A good dad wouldn't just sit there and watch TV. He would care about doing stuff with his kids. A good dad would want to have a good relationship with me. Right now, I don't want to see you. The time's not right. I don't really know what you could do so that I would want to see you again. How do you think you are going to change this? It's up to you. My message to Dad is, just step up your game.
Across a number, but not all of the interviews and digital stories, there was a faint but present ray of hope. Some children and young people did believe that their fathers could change, and they did hope to have a more positive relationship with their fathers into the future, on some conditions and on their terms. And that's really important addition. Children and young people in my study described the concept of reparation, or wanting their fathers to make it up to them, as something really important to them. And this was whether or not they wanted a relationship with him in the future, or whether they just wanted a sense of closure to then go on with their lives. The process of reparation described by the children and young people had 3 stages. The first stage I've called addressing the past. So the first thing that children and young people talked about was wanting their fathers to acknowledge he'd done wrong, and wanting their fathers to acknowledge he'd caused them harm and then apologise for causing that harm. And, these do not seem like radical things. They do seem like things that we would expect anybody who'd wronged us to do to make it up to us. But when I asked the children in the study about this, and when they talked about this issue in their sibling groups, it was quite radical. So they were laughing and they were saying, but can you ever imagine our father ever doing that? And they couldn't. They were laughing. And I said to them, but what would it mean if he did? And, they stopped laughing and they said, it would be huge. It would be really, really important to us. For some young people in the study, they said, well, that would be a good start, but my father has a tendency to apologise and then he just keeps continuing the same behaviour. So I would like not only see an acknowledgement and an apology, I'd also like to see my father accept the consequences. And for these young people, what the consequences were really varied. So for some young people, the consequences were, I want my father to spend some time in prison or do some jail time. For others, and that hard-end criminal justice sanction. For others, they just wanted their father to acknowledge and accept that his children would just be a little bit weird around him for a while, is how they described it. And they wanted their father to accept that that was because of his behaviour, not because they're badly behaved children. The next element of reparation I've called commitment to change. So for a number of young people, they said, an apology and accepting the consequences is a good start, but it's not enough for me because I have had apologies in the past. I also want to see a concrete commitment to change. I want to see my father really commit to changing. And so, when I asked them what they thought they wanted their fathers to do, they talked about wanting their fathers to attend a program, get support, get counselling, were the kind of things they talked about. And when I asked the children in the study whether they knew whether their own father had attended any programs or support, they had no idea. So, they really didn't know. And I think it's a really interesting point. I asked the children and young people, do you think that children should be informed when their father attends a program, and would you like to be involved in your father's change process? And the responses were really varied. So some children and young people said, oh, I'm not sure, that sounds a bit scary. Other young people said, I definitely would. I want to know what he's doing, when he's turning up, where he's sitting in the room, whether he's sitting there with his arms crossed, whether he's participating, what he's saying. They wanted minute details. And I think there were children, everything in between on that spectrum, from I'm not sure, it sounds scary, through to I want to know every single thing. But the one consistent message that they gave was we should be given an opportunity and a choice whether we want to be involved or not. In terms of what they wanted their fathers to get out of attending this program or counselling or support, they wanted to see their fathers change his attitudes, particularly his attitudes towards women, but also his attitudes towards his children. And they wanted to see a change in behaviour, as you'd expect. They didn't want the violence to reduce. They wanted it to stop. And that was a really consistent message. The third stage I've called rebuilding trust. And this stage was particularly important for those young people who still did have that door open on the potential for having a relationship with their father into the future. So in terms of what they wanted to see and how they thought their father could rebuild trust, they talked about a number of elements. The first thing they wanted their fathers to do was to invest time and effort in finding out what their interests are. A number of the children said, my father would have no idea who my friends are at school, what my favourite subjects are, what sport I play, what I'm interested in. And so that was a really key aim, was they really wanted their fathers to find out what they're interested in and then to set up activities that related to their interests, rather than dragging the children along to activities he's passionate about, which a number of them talked about. They also wanted their fathers to step up to parenting and co-parenting. And, the parenting was interesting. And I asked them about the kind of activities they'd like their father to do in terms of this idea of stepping up came out of a number of the interviews. And I was wondering what that might look like. I was wondering if there might be grand gestures or expensive holidays. But what I found was the exact opposite. Almost everything they suggested in terms of what they wanted from their father in terms of parenting took very little time and cost none or very little money. And, it was really interesting to explore. When I asked the young people about the kind of things they wanted, they talked about, I want my father to help me with homework. I want him to come and watch me play sport. I want him to come and watch my dance concerts. I want him to help me become better at, whichever sport they were particularly passionate about. And, as a research team, we were reflecting on these findings. And, for us, the things that these children were asking for in terms of parenting, we would consider the most basic base level of parenting. And yet this was aspirational for the young people in this study. In terms of co-parenting, children were really clear that the way in which their father treated their mother was really the most crucial factor that determined whether they wanted a relationship with him or not. A number of the children talked about their father saying to them, well, I've never hit you, so I'm not sure why you're, so upset with me. And the children really wanted their fathers to know that every time he sends an abusive email or text message or phone call to their mother, that then incapacitates her for a period of time, and that impacts them significantly. So they talked about, every time my mum gets a text message from my dad, she's crying for the next 2 hours and she can't help us with homework, or she can't take us to dance lessons, or she's not well enough to make our dinner, or, and they talked significantly about that, the issue around the interaction that their father had with their mother and how deeply it impacted their lives. And the final point that children made was that they really wanted their fathers to acknowledge that they have a right to have a perspective. And a lot of their fathers told them that they didn't have a right to be upset. They hadn't been physically hurt, that they were just children and they didn't know what was going on. And they really pushed back against that. They were very aware of what was going on. They felt they had a right to have a view, to be angry if they wanted to be angry. And they also felt they had a right to choose to forgive or not. A number of the children talked about feeling societal pressure to forgive their fathers when they actually weren't in a position where they felt they wanted to. So in terms of implications of this study, I think, this study has a broad range of implications for the way we deliver services to family experiencing domestic violence. And I think this is true whether we're working with children or we're working with fathers or both. Firstly, I think it's really important to acknowledge that what children and young people tell us about living with fathers who use violence greatly contrasts with what we hear in the community, the media, and the courts. And what we hear is that it's possible to be a violent husband, violent and dangerous husband on one side and a good father on the other. But children's experiences and their views do not support this. There is also a tendency to assume that all fathers are an important and positive presence in their children's lives. And the findings of this study, like many other studies that have been done with children who have experienced domestic violence, really don't bear this out. We know that men who use violence are more likely than other fathers to subject their children to other forms of child abuse and coercive control. And we need to make sure that we are asking children about their relationships with their father rather than making assumptions, and children say that we do this a lot. There is also an assumption that because children have not been physically harmed by their father, they've not been impacted. In my experience, children find the impacts of emotional abuse they experience from their fathers incredibly damaging and long-lasting, and that was something they spoke a lot about. There's also an assumption that all children feel conflicted about their feelings for their father. And in my experience, some children do feel that way and do feel really conflicted, but other children are not conflicted at all. They're very clear about how they feel. And I think we need to ask children questions about how they feel so that we can respond in a way that builds rapport and trust and honours their lived experience and their agency. It's important that when we work with families experiencing violence, that the use of domestic violence is described as a parenting choice. And I think there's a real opportunity for those who work with children to influence the content and work within programs for men. And I see that collaboration between services who work with men and those that work with children and adult victim survivors as really crucial. Currently in Australia, the interventions we have available for men who use violence often claim to improve parenting and make children safer. But when we actually look at the program content, they're really variable in how they address parenting issues and how they embed the voices of children in their programs, if they do either of these things at all. Sometimes the way in which programs for fathers who use violence are advertised or introduced to men is really problematic as well and doesn't allow for child agency or choice. And children talked about this in my study. Often you'll see a flyer. Do you want to be a better father and have a better relationship with your children? Then attend this program. And children were saying, well, where's our agency? Hang on, you don't just need to attend a program, then you'll have a better relationship with your children. What about the bit where the children get to say whether they want to have a relationship with them or not? So being really careful about our language was something that children and young people really pointed out. And I think it's a really valid point. We know that most programs that work with men who use violence don't engage children in their father's change process beyond a little bit of partner contact work with their mother. And I think this is problematic in a number of ways, as it's clear that some children would really like to be involved in their father's change process. And if programs are not checking in with children, how can we measure whether they are making a difference? We know that outcomes for children are rarely considered in determining whether a program for men who use violence has been a success. And some UK researchers, Alderston and colleagues, have argued that encouraging honest and open dialogue between fathers and their children about their participation in a program to address their behaviour could actually be a really important role of programs for men. And I think this is a really valid point. How this would work in practice certainly isn't straightforward. There is a pilot program in Victoria that has been exploring ways to run a program for men who use violence based on the principles of reparation and involving children in the process. And it hasn't been smooth sailing, but from my perspective, I think it's been really exciting that these conversations are being had, things are being tried, and practice knowledge is being gained and shared. And I thought it might be useful to connect these implications with some of the big picture changes to the way we respond to domestic violence that are happening in the state where I live. A number of the reforms focus on developing a system-wide web of accountability for perpetrators, as well as a more child-focused approach to risk assessment and management. And one of the major vehicles that has been introduced to progress these aims is our new multi-agency risk assessment and risk management framework, the MARAM. Everybody calls it the MARAM, and that's a picture of it there. The MARAM framework places a legislative responsibility on a range of prescribed frontline community services workforces, a really broad range from housing, health services, child protection, drug and alcohol, community mental health, maternal child health nurses, courts, schools, and the list goes on. A key focus of this framework is encouraging workers to look for ways to place the responsibility for domestic violence back on the person using violence and not on the person experiencing violence. And I think this is really important in the context of parenting, where there has been a tendency to scrutinise how protective the primary caregiver or the non-violent parent is, rather than framing the discussion around the perpetrator's behaviour and how it is placing children in danger. And so this work that's going on in Victoria is drawing heavily on the Safe and Together model developed by David Mandel in the United States, which many people are probably familiar with. And if you're not, I would certainly suggest logging on and listening to some of his very brilliant podcasts. So the MARAM framework now requires a broad range of frontline services to undertake a family violence risk assessment for each individual child and young person in a family, whether they ever meet those children or not. And this is something a lot of people are really excited about. And I thought it might be useful just to show you some of the practice guidance that frontline workforces are being given, which I've cut and pasted into this slide. So the framework suggests that it's ideal to be asking children directly about their experiences, but that even if these workforces never meet with a child, it's their responsibility to, at the very least, ask questions about the safety of all children in the family and to request information about children from other services to complete their risk assessment. The framework is clear that children within the same family can have very different experiences of domestic violence. We know this from research. What the violence looks like can vary dramatically, as can the risks and protective factors. And unless we ask these questions, we might miss out on identifying and responding to significant risk. And for some workforces here, these shifts have been fairly seamless. However, for others, it's been momentous and very challenging. Workforces who have not seen a child's client as their responsibility or speaking with children as part of their skill set are now being told that they need to broaden their thinking and develop collaborative approaches with other services that do hold that expertise. So we're working with some workforces to change their thinking from, well, I haven't got the skills, and if I engage with children, it might be re-traumatizing and cause harm, to how can I ensure that I approach conversations with children who have experienced domestic violence in a way that is trauma-informed and safe, and draw upon the expertise of others within and outside my organisation to do this. And we know from other research that children do not necessarily want to be the chief decision makers about what happens next, but they often do want to be offered an opportunity to be involved in the discussion. And as I mentioned at the outset, I'm involved in a number of projects which are being co-designed with survivors. And I think this is the way forward, both in terms of research, but also in terms of service and policy design. And I think we need to start exploring ways of working with young people as domestic violence experts to co-design service responses that meet the needs they identify as most important. And I really like this quote. This is one of my favourite quotes that comes from an Australian study about children's participation, where a 16-year-old boy says, "If my life was made into a movie, I wouldn't be allowed to watch it. There'd be drugs, alcohol, adult themes, violence, language. Most people think we can't cope talking about this stuff, but they need to hear it and we need to say it." Such a powerful comment. And I think the message I want to leave you with today is that when we are providing support to children and young people who've experienced violence, we want to be very much focused on safety, but we also want to be actively looking for ways we can offer children greater agency and voice, whether that is by asking them about their experiences, not making assumptions, involving them in decision-making, co-designing services, and including their voices in evaluation. My experience tells us that when we are quiet and we really listen, we can be surprised what young people have to say. And in providing that opportunity for a young person to have a say, we might actually also be paving that first step on the way to healing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. That presentation was profound and so full of insight. And I so agree with what you're talking about in the context of offering children opportunity and choice, and really listening to their voice in terms of the services that are provided, and indeed the policy framework in which those services reside. And I think what you've really demonstrated is how much we have to learn from children and young people, and what they can then tell us about what they need in terms of service provision, and also what they need in terms of the legal and policy framework that's supposed to support their best interests. And I know from our perspective in Barnardos, absolutely reparation is something that we really do need to give consideration to. And sometimes I think that what can happen within a particular framework is that we don't think about the fact that we have to be flexible enough to be able to respond to each individual child and their unique needs and circumstances. And there may be some children, for example, in the context of the father being the perpetrator of domestic violence, who may never want to see that father again, and some who may, and that we need to be open and flexible to what each particular child needs, and not bring our own views and agendas to their particular story. So thank you so much. And I'm sure those of you who are listening would like opportunities to reflect and indeed discuss what Katie has said. And just to remind us all that we are recording this webinar, and it will be available to all of you to look at and listen and indeed discuss with each other as we think through how we can improve things for children through getting the insights from research such as that Katie has produced. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who will be in conversation with a project leader from Barnardos. So the person we're now going to have the pleasure of listening to is Helen Oxahan. And Helen is originally from Cork and is now living in Australia. And she is a survivor of childhood domestic violence and abuse. And she's dedicated her life to supporting women and children. And Olive, who you also see in front of you here, Olive is a long-standing member of Barnardos. We're very lucky to have her, and she's a project leader in Thurles. So I'm really looking forward to your conversation. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. Good evening, Helen.
Thank you. Good evening to you too.
Helen, I first was introduced to you from the RTE documentary On One last August. It was my first time that I heard you speak about your own experience of childhood domestic violence, and then the work that you went on to do with women and children living with domestic violence. So I know the audience today are very keen to hear you speak. So could you maybe start with telling us how your story started?
Well, my earliest story was at home, and our father. We always had to keep quiet when we were around Dad. He was very easy to get annoyed. It was very easy to have problems. And then when he really did get very, very angry with us, he would come and he would have a row with my mother, and or he would have a row with the children. You would do wrong, and then my mother would step in to look after us, and he would beat her. And if he was beating her, I remember banging his two knees to get him away from beating her at the back of us. And that was our life. He was totally listening to the other story about the children. We would have loved to have. Look, we screamed. We were all young children, and we screamed very loudly. And we lived in a corporation house. And I'm sure that the neighbors heard it. And I know that still goes on today, that women scream about what happened, about what's happening to them. And there's nobody there to take anything. Now, I was born in 1930, so it's probably a whole load of different time. But there's still so much things that are the same. So many things that are familiar, what the children say, that you think, are we ever going to be able to get on top of that? I started off wanting to love my father. Yeah, I used to sit on a chair and think, and he had lovely curly hair, and I wanted to comb it with a comb. But I was afraid to do that. I'd be terribly afraid to get up at his lap and comb his hair. Now, that was how we lived in that house.
Yes, yeah.
And she did too.
And Helen, would you be able to talk a little bit about how that kind of affected your childhood, impacted for you?
Yeah, it was horrific for us. I couldn't even learn in school. I would go to school and the whole thing would be going around in my head while we were there. And if I had bruises, which I had quite a lot of bruises, I would have to lie about what happened to them. Like I fell over something or somebody or something, but I never told my dad. I never said anything about him for a long time while we were young. When I got older, I got angry.
Yes.
My love turned into anger for what was happening to my mother. And when I saw the way she was suffering, I decided that I would do something. And then I started to, we went to the priest, and when I'd go to the doctors, when surely the doctors would see the children from that house was always coming with bruises and needed stitches. But nobody asked you. And our neighbors would have heard us. Our neighbors would have surely heard that, but nobody said anything. So it was dead silence. He was a house devil and a street angel, and we had to just put up with it. Even today, I think that, we had silence. We didn't say anything about it. And let me show you what is in now. Domestic violence. Look.
Yes.
Look.
I see.
Nobody comes. Nobody comes. Who can you say it to? If I had some lovely lady coming to our house and talking to us, we had the police coming, and my father was so charming and so lovely that he would say, and where would we go anyway if we had to leave there? There was nowhere for us to go. And the police would come and talk to him and say, blah, 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 don't do that again. And he would somehow talk to them and make out that my mother probably was promiscuous, and he was looking after us, and we were very wayward children. And it was okay. I don't know why they didn't do anything about it.
And Helen, you have spoken about talking to policemen when you were about kind of 14, that kind of. You want to tell us?
I went to a detective. I had he the night before, I think, or 2 days before, he hit me with his belt, and the buckle must have broke some. I needed stitches anyway in my head. And I went to the doctor, and if I was waiting for the doctor to ask me the questions, the right questions, just the right questions, and I would have told him. I would have cried and I would have told him, because I felt so ashamed. They had to shave my hair to give me the stitches. And, I was 14, I had to wear a pixie. You will know what a pixie is. And I had to go to school and I had to make up a story of what happened to my head. Like I was under the table. The story went, I was under the table and I bumped my head. I couldn't even tell it right because it was such a desperate lie. But you didn't tell on them. You didn't say anything about it. You hid it. It was something that you hid. And my family, I'm sure my family wasn't the only one. Lots of children were suffering with stuff like that when they were in Ireland at the time.
Yes. And Helen,
it was drink.
Sorry,
it
Helen.
Was drink. With some of the men, it was drink. My father didn't drink. If he did drunk, I would have felt sorry for him, and I would have thought he couldn't help it. It wasn't his fault. I had nothing to say why it wasn't his fault. Nothing.
I understand. Yes, Helen. And I know you've spoken a little bit about knowing there was a different way of life from visiting your grandmother.
Because I had a grandmother in Limerick, and Uncle Tommy, and Uncle Tommy was just so wonderful to be around. Uncle Tommy and her, and they joked, and I saw a different side of life. I saw how men could be different. You weren't scared of all men. You could say what you wanted to say. Maybe I was thinking maybe it was my fault. Maybe I was too cranky, or maybe I just would ask the wrong questions, or you know how you think it's your fault. And when I was with Nana and Tommy, life was beautiful. I didn't want to go home. And so every holiday I would get there, and it was oxygen to me. And I cried. I didn't want to go back.
Yes. Yeah.
But I couldn't stay there.
Right, Helen. And Helen, there's a very varied audience listening today, and there's policymakers, there's managers, there's practitioners, there's people who lived and are living with domestic violence. Are there particular messages that you'd like to give, in terms of how we should work with children and women?
I think if you give a child a chance, they will tell you. I'm sure that if I'd had somebody that came to me, look, we went to the priest. My mother went into the confessional and we were waiting outside and we were thinking, now we'll get help from the priest. I can't remember what the priest said to her, but it was something like, it's your cross to bear in life. And when she came out and she was crying, can you imagine how we felt? We thought, we're going to get help now. We didn't get help from anywhere. The neighbors didn't help us. We couldn't go to Nana because Nana didn't want to have anything to do with him. She obviously knew what he was like. Where could we go? Nobody believed you anyway. And you were ashamed to say that about your dad because you didn't really want to tell them stories. It was kind of, you just suffered it in silence. And I know that still happens today.
Helen, absolutely. We know that, don't we, from listening to children and families, that there are a lot of children who find it really, really difficult to talk about, and a lot of women who find it really difficult to talk about what's happening. Yes. And I know a lot of the women we've worked with kind of through the recovery program that we deliver here will talk about how it's affected kind of their relationship with their children. And I know you've spoken a little bit about your relationship with your mum. Is it okay for you to talk a little bit about that now?
With my relationship with my mother?
Yes.
With my mother? I had a lovely mother. She was a country woman from Ireland, and she was very good looking, and she had a lovely sense of humor, and she tried to make us laugh. And she would have that wonderful Irish humor about her that when we were in the middle of crying, when he knocked the dresser down, and all the plates and things were on the floor, and we were picking them up again, and we were crying and she was crying. And then she would stop and sit us down and then tell us a funny story, like, do you know what happened to the cat when Dad knocked the dresser down? And we said no. She said he ran up the chimney or something, and then we'd all laugh, you know. So she would take our mind. She would stop. I could see it. She would just stop what was happening to her, how she was feeling. She would put herself there for the kids. That saved our lives. That saved our sanity, actually.
Yes, yeah. And we know, don't we, that women are continually finding ways to protect their children while dealing with this.
Sure, where would they go, darling? Where would they have gone? There was nowhere for them to go. That's why I worked for a shelter. I thought if women have somewhere to go, they'll get out of it. But that didn't happen either. But I thought that was the end all. Get somebody to listen to you. Go to a place where you don't have to live with it anymore. But it's still happening today.
Yes, Helen. And are you able to tell us a little bit about the work that you went on to do in Australia?
Well, I made sure that I married a nice man. Yeah.
Yes.
And I made sure there had to be a dictator. It would be me, and I would be a benevolent dictator. That's what I thought. He was a lovely man, and he had gone through lots of the war, and so he'd had been open to violence then, and he knew what it was like, and he was non-violent completely. And so we got on very well. And he opened a shop. He was a jeweler, and he opened a shop right on a main road down in Christie's Beach. That's a suburb of Adelaide. And when the shop was going, and sometimes I served the shop, I saw the women coming in with their children. I talked to them because I talk a lot. I talked to the people that came in, and the women eventually would tell me about, I was supposed to be selling them rings, but I would tell them, don't buy that, it's rolled gold, don't use that, and buy yourself something decent for the kids or whatever. And we started to talk together. And one worked in the Department of Community Welfare on Beach Road, down the road, and she was telling me about the women that was there. And so I thought, that's it. We look for somewhere to take women away. So we went and done women's studies in Flinders University. There was three together. And when we went to the university, we couldn't believe it. There were so many other so many other women started to talk about their lives. And then we decided there was some money going, and we made it I can't remember now the words. I'm getting old. We wrote a way to get some money for a Women's International Year, and we got a house. A housing trust house in Christie's Beach. Took us a long time now. This happened over years. Now we had a house, and we had just no furniture, nothing else. We got our furniture from the dump, and women came around, reveled around, and then we got tables and chairs and anything that people were throwing out, we took in. And St. Vincent de Paul helped, and all the other agencies helped a little bit. And then we had a women's shelter. And then I heard the stories. And then I thought, I was bad, but I can tell you that their stories were a lot worse than mine, some of those beautiful women. Yeah. And what could you do? I just thought for me, the rescue would be if you could get women out of that situation. And some of them didn't want to be out of the situation. Some of them wanted to go back again. And that was better, that they could come there and they had somewhere else to go. And so if they were suffering violence at home, the husband, it shocked some of the men and made them think twice about it. Maybe she can go somewhere else. Maybe there is. And when they would come and they would see, what she would tell about what was happening in shelters and with the other women. And I think sometimes that they were able to get on better. And there was lots of other women that we had to really hide.
Yes. Yeah.
Long story. I have interviewed some of those women, and I'm not allowed to tell. I don't want to tell their stories to anybody. And I have documented it and put it away in the library, and put 30 years of embargo on it. And then it can come out. It can come out later on so that their kids, women won't do that because it reflects on their children. And I'm sure that my family would have hated me the way, because I went around telling everybody. I went around talking about it.
Okay. Yes, Helen. And again, I suppose you have kind of named that even though you spoke about it, you felt that there wasn't, you weren't heard, you weren't listened to. And I suppose kind of from your own experience and from your work experience as well, I know we've heard a lot from Katie and from Steph about listening to children, the importance of research, the importance of hearing children's voices.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you feel that you'd like to kind of add to what we've heard?
Okay, it's terrible for the children, and you go through it and you manage, but you know that I still suffer from that. We're still working now to get. When I found out that the women that went to shelters weren't really, it wasn't really, and when I heard that 54 women died, 54 women last year just died because of domestic violence. It's like as if they were falling out of airplanes and there was nobody there to catch them or didn't care. And it broke my heart. It broke my heart. I thought, I want to mourn those women like I wanted to mourn the women that died. I want to mourn them. We have statues everywhere for men that go out to war. But what is there to talk about the women that gave their lives for us, for their children? Done without clothes. Went to the market and bought clothes for her. Went around with she used to put cardboard in her shoes because she didn't have shoes that she could walk in. And she would come home from the shops and she would throw the red cardboard into the fire and put more cardboard in her shoes for to keep going. That's what women do for their kids. And I thought, I want to mourn those women. I want to mourn my mother. They gave their life for us. And so we're looking now to get a place of courage so that we can go there, we can talk about our experience and not be ashamed and not think it's our fault and expect to be treated like a human being. We need more women. We need more women in Parliament. We need somebody else for a voice for us. We can't just go on doing what we're doing because it's not working. It's not working. I want to be able to think that my daughter can come up in a nice inner world and that all the other women, I want us to live in somewhere where women is in charge of it and they're making the decisions and I like them decisions that they're making. I will feel home and I want to be happy. Today I went out and I looked at some, we're getting a monument made and I looked at that and I thought, I'm getting old now, I'm 90. And I really want to live my life because it seems to me that I've been working all the time for women or for myself or whatever. I want to start reading books. I couldn't read any books at home. My father would say, are you reading a book? Have you nothing better to do? Go into the kitchen and help your mother. And then I go into the kitchen to my mother and she'd say, it doesn't matter, Helen. Are you cranky because he just sent you? Yes, I am. Well, you go out and play. You're a child once. Yeah, you be a child now. You'll have plenty of time to learn how to cook, she said. And she was so right. She was so right. And I thought, now I want to read books. I've a chance now. I'm 90. But I was, you know what? I can't bring it over myself to read a book. If I sit down, I still feel guilty if I read a book. I thought, maybe I should be hanging the washing out. Maybe I should be doing something else.
You enjoy that reading, Helen. You take to it. I said it's important that you allow yourself the time and take to that.
Well, I haven't got much time left. But there's a couple of books that I really would like to, because we couldn't read books at home. He'd ask you, what are you doing? Go do something else. It was like living, I don't know, it was like living with a a rope around your neck and you're waiting for it to happen to go wrong. No.
Yes.
I think we should listen to our women. I think we should listen to what they say.
Yes.
And if we get them to talk. Yeah, I don't want to be nasty about them or anything, but look, I have here this has all happened. This has all happened. This has all happened in Australia. Yeah?
Yes, yes.
There's a man who jumped off, not far from where I live now, jumped with his 18-month-old daughter strapped to him, and he jumped out of that and killed the 18-month-old daughter. What,
I know. Yes.
Is that normal?
And Helen, the place of the place of courage, it sounds like a fantastic project. And I know, when we spoke to Zita the last day, who's part of the project, I know she's there with you.
She is.
And really powerfully, Zita really powerfully spoke about the importance of that. Yes, it's really important that at all levels we're supporting children and women living with domestic violence. We mustn't forget that the community has a role, that it's everybody's responsibility. And I love the idea of the place of courage that will make it much more visible to everybody that this is a real issue in our society.
How can you cure it if we don't bring it out into the open? How can we cure it? If you can't see it, how can you cure it? You can't. You've got to tell your stories. And you've got to say, look, I'm not happy about this. And I can't see any other way of doing it.
Absolutely, Helen. And I know sometimes it can be, we can find it hard, kind of, and an uncomfortable place, kind of sometimes listening, particularly to children's stories. But God, we know so much about how important it is that we are able to do that and support.
You don't know how hard it is for them when they're telling you the story. You hate talking about your parents. Do you know what I mean? You always want to talk about my dad can do this and my mother can do the other.
Yes.
Because you love them.
Of course. Yes.
No. Yeah. We need more love and less whatever.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely, Helen. Really important, but just so important that we are all really aware of what's happening. I know we need to be promoting sort of, like, as you say, more love, more positivity. We also need for people to be able to talk and tell their story, don't we? We need to be able to hear people's experience.
I think they should start in the schools. Because you know what, the kids see at home, they will do when they grow older. They see their mother being treated like that, and they do the same. You just have to read the papers and see here now how many girls are talking about the life they have when they go to schools. How they, it's not good. It's not good, girls.
And Helen, sometimes children talk to us, and I know you've spoke a little bit about this yourself, about how difficult it is to be in the classroom when all this is happening.
Yes. You go in there and you're fine for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then you go off. Your brain goes off into what happened last night at home. What was shouted? Why did they shout? Why did he shout like that? What happened? The terror comes back again. And you shake because you were in bed listening to him fighting with her downstairs. And you think, why is it like that? It wasn't like that in Nana's house.
Yes.
I knew there was a place where you could laugh and you could be yourself. I knew that. And why was it? It was like living in some place where it was, like a prison that you had to get out of. I couldn't wait to leave it.
Yes, I understand, Helen. And I know as well, and I know this is probably difficult for you, I know you spoke about kind of not understanding why your mum accepted this way of life for a time, and then you spoke about going back to her in later time.
Yeah, people were ashamed.
Yes.
We had a lot of shame. She was ashamed to go out. She knew the neighbors had heard it. She was ashamed to go out with her dark glasses, hiding the black eyes that she had. You don't want to, she just didn't, and nobody asked you. You see, if you had just had somebody that would come and say something, but everybody didn't want to know. It seemed like everybody didn't want to know. And when I went to the detectives, I went to a detective when I got a bit older, and I showed him my scar on my head, and I told him all about it. And he seemed a lovely man, and I thought, that's good. And he never came for about 4 months, and eventually he came to the door, and I saw him go in, and I thought, oh my God, I was skipping, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to get killed. And when he went, my father called me in, and I saw my mother in the hall crying. And he was very quiet. My father was really quiet. Usually he would have just hit you. And my mother was crying. And she said, I said, why are you crying? I was the one why? And she said, because he said you were promiscuous, and you're not. And you're so innocent about all that stuff.
Yes.
That hurt her more than anything else. So that what they'd say about you, you were a naughty girl, you were promiscuous, or my mother was so good looking that, all the men will come and get her. So they just let men talk to each other. That you can understand why the women need a little bite, need a little looking after them, a little bit of, I don't know. If they would only look at another side of it. Life is so short.
Of course.
Life is so short. It would have been so much better if we could have lived in harmony. But the world can't live in harmony. And look at the wars that are going on. There's thousands of statues here to men with guns, thousands of them. There's nowhere to go if you want to mourn your mother that died, or mourn the women that died. There is absolutely nowhere where I could have went and sat there and had somebody put their arms around me and talk like I'm talking to you now, and think and feel that kingship. You keep it to yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Helen, it's an absolute privilege to have this conversation with you. And I just
I'll have to go away and hide now. I'll have to hide for the next week.
You have so much insight, and it's just fantastic to hear you speak about it's really sad, and I know it's a really difficult experience, but it's just so powerful to hear you speak and to name it.
If we have more women like you guys, more women like you, more organizations like you that we can go to, I believe in you. I believe that you will do it, and when we have to start and we have to do it together. And I believe we can. I think we can.
Is it okay if I come in? Because I have to say, I was listening and I was dying to join the conversation just a little bit.
You're more than welcome.
So I just want to say, I feel like, just hats off to you, you strong, resilient, wonderful woman. And I think there should be a statue to you, both in Cork and where you're living in Australia. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. But I just wanted to ask you something. I was really struck by what you were saying, is that children, and including yourself as a child, you were just waiting for the right question.
Yes.
And what strikes me is that those of us who work with children and parents, whether we're in Barnardos, in a range of organizations, in schools, and the Gardaí, and everyone's trying to do their best job. But maybe it's what we really need to learn is how to listen, and how to listen to what's not said.
Yes. And you're ashamed to say it. You're afraid to say it, because they will go back and tell your father, or you'll cause trouble for your mother. I didn't want to cause trouble for my mother, and I didn't want to make it any worse than it was. And you would think, well, if they ask you, they will somehow take the responsibility. You want to give them the responsibility. You want them to draw them in and help you. You want them to understand. But then they would go and meet my father, you see, maybe at home, and he was as nice as pie. He was so charming. Charmed the leg off. You've no idea of it. And then they'd come out and they would. And my mother couldn't say, no, he does this, this, and this, because where could she go?
Yeah, exactly.
She was there.
Yeah, but the other thing was, what I think, Helen, is so powerful is, I think, and I don't know what your views on this. And listen, by the way, I'm delighted that you were sensible enough to choose a very nice man. So that's, again,
I was.
well done, great skill.
I was very careful. And he was great. Yes, he was very good. I can't say anything bad. He was so good to me, really.
Yeah.
He put up with an enormous amount of, because, I used to suffer at nighttime when we were married first. And we thought he was a bit crazy. The children did, together. And we thought the Luna, when the moon comes out, something happens to him and he goes, because he could be nice sometimes. And then another time it was like a volcano. And so we thought, oh, it's definitely mad. He's definitely mad. He's got his brain damage or something. And so every time the moon came out, we thought I couldn't sleep for years after that. Every time a full moon was there, I was thinking my mother at home, she would be going through agony.
Yeah. But can I just say, and I know we need to finish, but I really hope, that you're giving us so much. Like your generosity is phenomenal.
No, I wanted to change.
Yeah,
I don't want to live under this any longer. I don't want anyone
absolutely
to do it any longer. And you can't heal it till you take it out and look at it. Look at it first and then see what's happening.
Exactly. And I think that your generosity in talking about your experience and indeed what you've symbolized all your life is something that all of us listening here, like you're having a really important impact, because what you describe, and you're such a good you create such an incredible image that stays with all of us. So, and we all in our roles will do our best to continue carrying that torch.
Good.
And be part of it for children. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So can I
Men
say,
make wars and women pay the price. Yeah, they make wars. They go out and fight in wars and they get paid for it, right? Somebody pays them to go, and they know they're going to get killed or something. They don't go out there for fun. Yeah. We marry and we want love and companionship and all the rest of it at home, and they're in a bigger war. Nobody gets us ready for that.
Yeah, well, we could have another conversation about war. I'm with you there too about the.
I better go before I get you sacked.
I know. You see, I'm forgetting now. I'm on camera here. So there you go. I'm on camera. But can I just, say thank you so much. And I don't know, Olive, whether you want to probably echo that. And if we were, if you were here, we'd probably all give you a hug. And I don't even know whether you're a hugger, which is to say that
I'm a very good hugger, and I'm hugging you, and I'm hugging you especially. So do whatever you can. That will make me happy. That will make me happy.
Thank you so much, and just
thank you for listening. You too.
Helen, thank you. And hope to speak to you again at some stage. You take care.
You're more than welcome. You're more than Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, everyone, I'm sure, like me, you were quite impacted by that, and what a warrior, what a wonderful warrior. So I'd like now to introduce Anya Costello, who is the coordinator of the national, I always get these words wrong. So just to say that we were talking about this, it's not the national, it's actually the Children's Participation Project as it relates to domestic violence and abuse. And we are delighted that this is a project that's funded by TUSLA, who are showing fantastic leadership in this really, really important area. So over to you, Anya.
Thanks very much, Suzanne, and thank you, Helen, for the generosity of your story. I'm a bit probably thrown from it, so apologies if it takes me a minute to catch my breath. It was a phenomenal story, Helen, and I think much of what you said in that story will be reflected in some of the work of the children in Ireland that I'm going to talk to now in a few minutes. So I'm going to share my screen. I don't need to share it, Tess, am I right? Yeah, you have it up there. Brilliant. So as Suzanne was saying, I'm Anya Costello, the National Coordinator of the Childhood Domestic Violence Project with Barnardos. And I suppose when I spoke with Helen initially, and Heather, Helen's daughter, we were saying, well, what are you about? What's your project about? And I said, well, the overall purpose is really around assisting and increasing the visibility of childhood domestic violence and abuse, and that children are victims of domestic abuse in your own right. And I think anybody listening here today will agree with me in saying that children are central to the experience of domestic violence. We're really lucky we've been established about just over 2 years, and we've been working with many fantastic services around the country. So really supporting that collective collaborative approach and identifying the needs of children. When I started and we start mentioning children and domestic violence, it's been a very easy process because all the services that we've worked with, all the services that we've been asking to collaborate with has said yes straight away. And I think that shows the passion that's around Ireland in looking at children and their needs and how we can best support them. And as we mentioned already, our work is partnership with the TUSLA DSGBV service. So my role, I suppose, really looks at many different aspects of children and their journey from crisis, recovery, prevention through to recovery. But one of the most exciting aspects of my job is I facilitate the Childhood Domestic Violence and Abuse Participation Project. Really originated in the early stages of when we were established a year, 2 years ago. And we started looking at what do we mean? What is the children's journey? What is the children's experience? And when we started to look at definitions, realized that children were largely invisible in many of the definitions of domestic violence and abuse. When we think of domestic violence and abuse, we often think of the adult perpetrator and the adult victim. And in a lot of the definitions, children are mentioned as a tool or as a bystander. And I think from hearing Katie's research, from hearing Steph's introduction, and from Helen's incredible story, that children are not invisible in the experience of domestic violence and abuse, and they're really central. Their role is quite central. So in part of our work in defining what we mean by childhood domestic violence and abuse, we established a participation project last year. And it's really a multi-agency approach. We started in COVID, in lockdown, where hearing children's voices, you would think would be very hard to do. But we're so lucky to work with so many fantastic services around the country that enabled this work to happen during a time where children were probably silenced in last year. So I just want to give due credit to the services that we've worked with on this journey. So we're lucky to have EPIC, which is a national organisation for children's voices and children's rights for children in care. Meads Domestic Violence Service, Adapt Domestic Abuse Service, Coons Air in South Tipperary in Clonmel, Barnardos TLC Kids Project in North Tipperary and Cavan, or Limerick and Clare worked with us all last year. And we have so many more services come on board, which is just really fantastic that we're going to hear the voices of so many more children and young people. We're lucky to have Daughters of Charity in the Dublin Safer Family Service, which is in Dublin, which works with the children, women, children and perpetrators. Cope in Galway Domestic Violence Service and Refuge, Mayo Women's Support Services, Longford Women's Link, our New Barnardos Project, TLC Kids in Cavan Monaghan, Good Shepherd Centre in Cork, Offaly Domestic Violence Service, Barnardos Family Support Project in Ballyogan, and Saoirse Domestic Violence Service in Kildare and Dublin. And apologies, Saoirse, I know you've expanded and it's probably far beyond Kildare and Dublin. So I just want to say, I suppose it gives really the breadth and the geographical breadth of that we're going to cover in Ireland, and hearing children voices in a rural and urban context. And at the moment, that work is still ongoing. So when we started the working together, we realised, I suppose, we needed a framework to work within and a framework to collaborate. So we spent time looking at, well, how will that work? How will we work together? And the very obvious choice, which is adopted by TUSLA and is a participation project in TUSLA adopted by our government, so is the Lundy model for participation, which creates opportunities for us to work together. So the one-to-one engagement sessions is how these children were heard, and each individual organisation determined a child and young person's suitability to engage in this process, and each individual support agency provided the wraparound support for the children and young people who were involved in this process, and the suitability and to ensure that for these children and young people it was safe for them to participate and for us to hear their voices. So we look at the first two sections of the Lundy model. We look at space and voice, and those one-to-one engagement sessions that the services undertook with children and young people really took time to help those children to reflect and express their views in a safe way, and created that safe environment for children and young people. We've been doing our best over the last 6 or 8 months to try and create an audience, and here today is really a fantastic opportunity for us to have an audience for these children and young people's words and their story to come across. And we have a tall act to follow with Helen. And at the Childhood Domestic Violence Project, we work with many agencies around Ireland. So we're doing our best to create influence for the children who are involved in this project. So just to give you an overview then, so we started off last year and we consulted initially with 12 children and young people. And we asked them to describe what their experience of childhood domestic violence and abuse was like for them. And when the feedback came back, so as I mentioned, the services engaged in the one-to-one engagement sessions with the children and young people, and it was so powerful. We pulled together a definition of what childhood domestic violence and abuse looks like from a child's point of view. We try to remain as true while keeping the anonymity of all the children involved in the project, and that their story wasn't identifiable in any way. But we pulled together the common themes and threads in all the feedback from the children and kept it as true and unfiltered as possible. So here's what they have to say. So this is what we have developed from our last year's consultation, and it's a children's definition of domestic violence and abuse. So I'm going to read through it, and it is quite powerful. So I just, we'll have the support lines up at the end of this again. So it is shouting, name calling, crying, shattered glass, and sometimes punches, bruises, and blood. It gets louder and louder. They don't think we can hear it, but we can hear it in our rooms when we are in bed. Even it is in the last corner of the house. It is like a fighting match, and we are worried that Mum might get killed. When they text and ring, they only ask about Mum, and I feel like they only care about Mum, not us. It is as if we don't matter. Sometimes we are told whose side we are on, but we don't like it. It is a really bad feeling in our heart, and it feels like it's broken. We feel very, very angry, afraid, frustrated, worried, scared, confused, nervous, and sad. Sometimes we feel it in our bodies too. We might get weak, our eyes might go black, we get a pain in our belly, our bones start to hurt, and sometimes we don't feel like eating a lot. Sometimes we feel like hurting ourselves to make all our problems go away. We find it very hard to stay out of it. We try to stop it, but it doesn't work. We want to help Mum, but we feel like we are not in control. We try to get away and go outside, but this can be a very hard challenge. Our little sisters and brothers are relying on us, and it's our job to protect them. Our pets are important, and it's like they understand what is happening and how we feel. We hope it will pass in a few weeks and things will go back to normal. We are still kind of scared thinking about when it will happen again. If we expect it, we will be ready for it, so it won't feel as bad as last time. Some adults think children are stupid and they don't know what they're talking about just because they are little, but all children have a voice. So as you can see, it's a very powerful definition of domestic violence and abuse, where children describe the physical, the sensory experience in great detail. And what's not here actually, but what does feature in a lot of the feedback from the children, we must relook at it again, is something which reflects what Helen said, and when Helen mentioned about the nighttime. It was the nighttime that featured very strongly in a lot of the feedback from the children. And that picture there, one of the young people described how they'd like the cartoon that we're going to show, or the video that we're going to show in a few minutes, go from darkness into light. And that was, I suppose, the artwork that we try to reflect in the video. So that was our work from 2020, and the work is ongoing, as I mentioned, with all the services around Ireland. And we wanted to build on the children's experience, and we want to hear more from children and young people about what their experience of domestic violence and abuse is like. And we've heard from Katie and Steph and Helen talking about how important it is that we see children as unique victims, that we see children as unique in their own stories, individual to them. So this year's theme is around children's participation, and what we really wanted to hear this year is what matters to children who live with domestic violence and abuse. So we want to expand a little bit more on the experience of domestic violence and abuse, and especially in terms of understanding from a child's point of view what coercive control looks like in emotional abuse, the 24/7 eggshells. That our definition that I just read definitely alludes to it in many ways. And they ring and they only ask about mum. If we expect it, we'll be ready for it. That always waiting for it to happen feeling. So we hope to expand more on that experience of domestic violence and abuse. We want to hear from children what their top priorities are. What do they want to tell us? What matters for children and young people around Ireland? And that they may set the agenda then from where we go from here. And we want expert advice for children. What do we do well? What do we not do well? And how can we support children? What does support look like for a child? What really stands out for me with Helen's presentation, when she was at the doctor's surgery, wanting to be asked what's happening, and maybe to look beyond her stitches and her bruises and to be asked what else is happening, what other trauma is happening for her at home. So we want to hear from children and young people, their expert advice and what they want to tell us about how to support them in the best way possible. So that's our theme for this year. We're currently in the process of that, creating the space and voice for children, if you reflect on the Lundy model. And their services have identified children in Ireland and young people around Ireland and are currently engaged in the one-to-one engagement sessions. And we hope then, from when the information comes back from all the children and young people, that we will create more creative representation of those children's voices, and that children are as well involved in that creative process. We hope to create some infographics and hopefully an animation as well. And when we're putting out to tender for the animation, a huge part of that request is that the children and young people are involved in that process. So it's exciting to say, watch this space really in terms of where we're going with our participation project, and help us increase the visibility of children as victims in their own right around Ireland, in all of your networks, in your services, in your teams, that we can do this collectively on an individual level, in an organisational level, a local area level, and hopefully ultimately a national level in terms of policy and strategic direction for children. So I am going to, Tess, I hope I do this, stop sharing here, and I'm going to leave you my presentation today with a video that was made to represent the definition. As you can see, the definition is quite long, but it was very hard to put this video down to 60 seconds, and we had a very good production company that called us to do on it. So I'm just going to leave you with a video that we created from the children's voices last year.
It is shouting, name-calling, crying, and sometimes even punches, bruises and blood.
It gets louder and louder. They don't think we can hear, but we can, even if we're in the last corner of the house.
We're worried that Mum might get killed.
We hope it will pass and things will be back to normal, but we are still scared thinking about when it will happen again.
It's a really bad feeling in our heart. It feels like it's broken. Sometimes we feel it in our bodies too, and our bones start to hurt.
We find it really hard to stay out of it. We try to stop it, but it doesn't work.
It's our job to protect our little brothers and sisters.
Sometimes we are told whose side we're on. We don't like it.
Some adults think children are stupid, but all children have a voice.
Together, we can paint a better picture.
Well, I think we all know that together we absolutely can paint a better picture. And I know that we are all in our different roles and different agencies, whether we work in Thusla, whether we work in the Guards, whether we're in the community voluntary sector, whether we're in research, that we all do passionately care about children, and we really do want to listen to them. And we're open to developing and learning how to listen better so they really do feel heard, and that we create the right type of service response that really does help. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, who is Joan Mullen, who's a national programme lead in relation to the domestic sexual abuse and gender-based violence. Joan is fabulous to work with, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her closing remarks.
Good morning, Suzanne. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for the invitation to be here, and thanks for that lovely introduction. It's my real pleasure to be here, and it is to bring up the rear, I suppose, on and also the challenge of following all that's gone before. It hasn't been a fantastic morning. It really is fantastic and I suppose heartbreaking in equal and intertwined measure. I suppose it struck me just at the as Helen concluded with her powerful conversation with Olive, it struck me the real limitation of the online event, that we couldn't give a big clap and standing ovation, I think, for her testimony, I suppose, of her giving witness to her experience and the generosity of her life's work to improving things coming out of her own experiences so that other children and their mothers, their parents can have the opportunity for life in greater safety and happiness. So I felt kind of we really missed out on something there by the limitations of how we go, although these events are wonderful for us to be able to connect in to ideas. I suppose just it's been really our great satisfaction in Thusla to have worked with Barnardos as a partner over the last couple of years on the Domestic Violence in Childhood project that has been referenced earlier by Anya and Suzanne. I might just say a little bit about kind of how that's come about and why we're so enthusiastic about this piece of work. And this ongoing project and seeing it sort of grow shoots and sort of tentacles and capture different things. So it began, I suppose, arising out of work that was being done. I mean, we were very aware of the work being done by Olive and colleagues in Barnardos in the Midwest with the TLC Kids programme. And my colleague Doreen Cross was a huge champion for that. And I think our DV team, led by Thelma Bleheen, really wanted to try and get behind and do something around issues concerning, children, the sort of the information that was coming back through TLC Kids and the evaluation, and we had linked with Stephanie White on that, and through the funded DV services and through Thusla colleagues, this sense of either people seeing need and feeling not positioned well to respond, seeing that there were needs that went beyond whatever particular roles were, already responding, and there's huge amount of experience in specialist domestic violence services in working with children, but often that the capacity that they had and the needs of the children, the needs that were evident, were coming up, and there was a sense of like everybody wants to do something, and lots of people know things about what should be done, but how do we get it together and which things are the right thing to do? So I suppose in the course of the work, and we would have kind of made as part of business case for funding, prioritize this area of work to get something substantive in place, because what we were aware is that there's lots of pockets of good practice, there's lots of things happening, but everything is kind of a little bit limited, and only maybe some very, small, relatively small numbers of children and families can impact from some of the work that was going on. So I suppose our involvement, our interest and our vision has been around both the kind of the strands of actually getting things in place so that, there'll be something in place for the children who are suffering, whose lives are being limited by threats to their safety, by living in fear, and I suppose the ability to learn from that, also to find out what works, to listen to children and to bring them more to the forefront. And so with kind of the various pieces of information coming forward, I suppose that's why we got on board with a project that would try to bring all of that together and create a greater national capacity. And it really has, we can see and feel that it's growing. Anya came on board and like, I think anybody who has met Anya will know the enthusiasm, the passion that she has brought, and that she has been a wonderful advocate for the work. And I think, you know, our experience is that she has met equal passion and enthusiasm out there, you know, people who really care and want to be able to change something. And I think that, I suppose, so we're with this piece of work in Thusa. We really want to see it through, I suppose, and we want to learn. And I thought then that, you know, just listening to our colleagues and participants this morning, in Steph and Katie, you know, in terms of the voice of children, and of course the work of the Barnardos project as well, but you know, that idea of evidence and research, that we're talking about very heavyweight evidence that is absolutely about children's voices and children's choices. You know, I love the idea that we're actively using empowerment around children, and I think there's something that really came out for me this morning, that's around you know, there's some unifying themes. But that if you put the children's voices at the center of things, if you use something like the Lundy model to actually have a frame of reference that everybody is using around listening to and positioning children at the center of things, that the strands are both about the response to the children themselves. It's also about that it's not about the adult victim or the child victim, but that the children's experience also impact on how you respond to their mothers, and to actually the thing that just jumped out at me was the idea that that's also influencing the programs that are being provided to perpetrators and the messages that are going back, and so there's another cohort of both people and professionals, if you like, that are also taking on board the voice of the child in terms of influencing even what the experience in the home and the family is. So, and I suppose there's a growing body of research about what are the right things to do, what is it the children need, and, you know, ask them, talk to them. I was struck with Helen's comment about you know, that life is short. And speaking from such a long and well-lived life, and thinking about the small lives of children, and that what they know, this is all they know, and they don't have this wider frame of reference about all the possibilities that are there. So even allowing them to have their voice heard and impact, so that they can actually understand that there are choices for them, and that they're supported to make those choices. So with all of that, I think Anya's kind of direction of travel around the piece of work around children's participation, and the idea that we can all play a role. We need more commitment. We need, you know, the involvement of as many people as possible. I know that the community of practice is a huge national resource that's developing a set of people who, you know, have expertise and experience, and, you know, are coming together and all focusing on the issue of, you know, children who live in and live out of domestic violence situations, but are impacted on it. So with that, I suppose I'll finish up. Thanks very much for the really stimulating and fantastic quality from everybody this morning. And I suppose leaving with the thought from Helen that we all need more love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan. I have to say, there's two things that struck me. One is, I think that it would have been lovely to be together, and I think absolutely to be together in person, if you like, and we would have been giving a standing ovation to Helen. I think we might all be in tears now as well. It was so moving, you know. It was really, really profound and moving, and you know, you finished on, you know, mentioning the word love and care and attention. I think that all of us who have come into this work and who are interested, you know, that we bring the best of ourselves to it. And And I think that if we continue to do that, we can really, really make a difference as we are prepared to grow and develop. And a key part of the growing and developing is really listening to children in a way that they really feel heard, because they have a lot to give us in terms of what we need to do to help them. So I just want to finish by thanking everyone, thanking all the speakers, and thanking you for listening. I know it's not always easy listening on Zoom, but I hope that you got something that you found useful for yourself in your role in your practice. And just to let you know that we will have this on Barnardos YouTube for you to listen to again at your leisure. So thanks again, and do take care.